No, no, you couldn't manage. You saw me as baggage, you dead weight. Now the tables are turning, our bridges are burning, it's too late. Though the tears are still coming, now I found the courage, there's no hate. I'm not waiting for you to cure, you to heal me. I'm not waiting for your love, you can keep it. I'm not waiting for you to come back, you to let me down like that. I'm not waiting for you to cure, I don't need it. Taking me back to the way we were. Cause of you, I know what I deserve. Always the cause when I lost my nerve. No more. I'm not waiting for you to cure, you to heal me. I'm not waiting for your love. You can keep it. I'm not waiting for you to cure, you to heal me. I'm not waiting for your love. You can keep it. I'm not waiting for you to come back, you to let me down like that. I'm not waiting for you to cure. I don't need it.
Trying to hold my head up, I've been thinking about this mess we've made. Cause I shouldn't have to blame myself. Took what was taught as gospel, but I don't have a clue where to go from here. Cause I'm almost breaking, can't you tell? I don't even understand why I'm still here. I just need a minute to go through with it. I don't even understand why I'm still here. I gave you my all, but you still want more. I thought you were proud, but it's not enough. Try to sell me a lie that you thought I'd buy, but you don't decide, just thought I'd let you know. Just thought I'd let you know. Just thought I'd let you know. Not trying to play the victim, I just needed to get this off my chest. It feels like my senses have kicked in. I don't even understand why I'm still here. I just need a minute to go through with it. I don't even understand why I'm still here. I gave you my all, but you still want more. I thought you were proud, but it's not enough. Try to sell me a lie that you thought I'd buy, but you don't decide, just thought I'd let you know. Just thought I'd let you know. Just thought I'd let you know. I gave you my all, but you still.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, DJ Chiquito, for all the wonderful music. Good morning, all. Welcome to Chabot College 4th Annual Ethnic Study and the second summit that we have online. We are so happy to have you all here. My name is Laura Larcon. I am a psychology counselor instructor and career and academic counselor at Chabot College, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our summit today. We have 505 participants right now. And we would like to know where you are joining us from. Just type on the chat your school. Let us know your indigenous land. Where are you joining us from? Castro Valley, of course, Hayward is present. Old Town, oh yeah, Old Town, Fremont. We have a lot of Chabot students here. Yes, we also have our Chabot faculty. Thank you so much. James Logan, of course, one of our feeder high schools, Union City, Monterrey. Wow, Burlingame, Mexico? Okay. This is so exciting. Las Positas, of course, our sister college. So much welcome. This is absolutely wonderful. The Ohlone Community College, all colleges here in other colleges in California. We have alumni. Wow, this is absolutely wonderful. Clovis Community College. Fantastic. This is something that was beyond our dreams when we were actually planning to bring Angela Davis to Chabot College. I also see some deans. I see my Dean Trick, hello. I see, of course, Dean Nakamoto, thank you so much. This is absolutely wonderful to have all of you here. So welcome all, and allow me to introduce to you the faculty who are responsible for conceiving of and organizing the Ethnic Studies Summit. The Ethnic Studies Faculty Inquiry Group is comprised of we are a group of faculty who come together, who come and meet and plan the summits. And we are comprised by Kay Fisher, who is our Ethnic Studies Chair. We also have Ulises Acevedo, who is our instructor of ethnic studies, and he also teaches in high schools. We are also very happy to have Dr. Juan Pablo Mercado with us as a member of our faculty inquiry group. We also have two student panelists today, Gabriela and Lahana, and they will introduce themselves a little later when we start to speak to Angela Davis. So, before we proceed to the land acknowledgement, I would like to take a second to thank a few folks that made this year's summit possible. Abby Patton is the former El Centro Director and Interim Pathways Dean. She is essential in everything that has to do with this FIG, her support from the very beginning and trying to get us to sign paperwork and get us organized. And she was, from the very beginning, the person who helped us with this FIG. So thank you, Abby. Bobby Nakamoto, of course, the Interim Dean in Social Science. Bobby, thank you so much for all your support and all the behind the scenes that needed to happen for today's summit. Thank you. Thank you for your support. This summit is possible thanks to the SASE committee. They provided funding for this event. Thank you to all the members of SASE committee, and of course, Monique, for being the rep for social science and helping us get all the funding for this event. Thank you. We also want to thank the Language Arts Division and BACA for your help with arranging with the ASL interpreters. Our interpreters today are Lisa Washington and Sean Merriman Roberts. We also want to thank the Stay Woke Collective and all the students and the faculty who have continuously supported this event. We also want to thank Susan Sperling, our president, for being here. Hi, Susan. I was a little nervous before and couldn't say hello. So nice to have you among us. The Ethnic Studies Faculty Inquiry Group is truly grateful for your support and commitment to our annual Ethnic Studies Summit. So now I will turn it over to Lahaina Morales for the land acknowledgement.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Lahaina, and thank you all so much for attending. Happy Friday. And I just wanted to begin by giving the Chabot College land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land and the peoples to whom this land belongs. This is Ohlone land, and they are still here. We stand in solidarity with all Indigenous people and their right to self-determination and justice. We commit to working toward the healing of the generational trauma, theft, and dispossession Native peoples have faced and continue to face. And now I'll pass the mic to our college president, President Sperling, with our college welcome.
Thank you, Professor Alarcon, and thank you, Lahaina Morales, for the beautiful land acknowledgement. Welcome on behalf of Chabot College to this year's Ethnic Studies Summit. And a special shout out and thanks to you, Professor Kay Fisher, your Ethnic Studies colleagues and students for this wonderful event, which continues to expand our vision and consciousness of justice and resistance. We are so deeply honored to host this year's keynote speaker, Professor Angela Davis. It is not hyperbole to describe Dr. Davis as one of the foremost progressive public intellectuals of the last 50 years, not only in the United States, but beyond the United States. From the 1960s through the present, she has been a leader in progressive thought and deed on issues of equality, inequality, the rights of the oppressed, the accused and incarcerated, and for liberation movements around the globe. She is an author, teacher, activist, and leader in the struggle for human dignity. On a personal side note, she was one of my husband's most influential teachers in forming his work as a civil rights and housing rights activist and attorney in the Bay Area. Of course, this applies to thousands, if not millions, of the rest of us who have studied her work or had the honor of being actually a student of hers. Her achievements in the cause of justice could fill several lifetimes. As a seminal thinker and activist, her work has informed much of our current understanding of the intersections of racism, patriarchy, mass incarceration, and capitalism. Her insights have informed 20th and 21st century movements of resistance, linking analysis to resistance from one generation to the next. And I think we see that in the plethora of young folks here who are joining us. We are so honored to have you at Chabot College, Professor Davis. And we now turn the program over to one of its chief organizers and founder, Professor Kay Fisher. Thank you.
Thank you, President Sperling, and good morning, everybody. We're so excited to welcome you to our 4th annual Ethnic Studies Summit. So I would like to take a moment to talk a little bit about our incredible Ethnic Studies program. It's very young and it's small, but it's quickly growing, and we're excited to share the work that we're doing here at Chabot College. So the Ethnic Studies program at Chabot College is, and Ethnic Studies in general, is an interdisciplinary and unique scholarly field which centralizes and redefines the experiences of Black, Indigenous, people of color communities in the United States and transnationally, using an intersectional analysis. Ethnic Studies was born out of the people power movements of the various communities of color in the 1960s and led by the efforts of the Black Student Union and Third World Liberation Front. Ethnic Studies emphasizes the praxis of resistance and liberation in order to eliminate all forms of injustice and oppression, especially along race, ethnicity, gender, class, and sexuality. And for those of you who are following the news on ethnic studies, with the passing of AB 1460, ethnic studies is now a new requirement for CSU students and transfers starting fall 2021. And this is the list of degrees that we currently offer under the ethnic studies umbrella at Chabot College. And for those of you who are high school students, welcome. We're so excited that you're here. And we also wanted to take this opportunity to share that Chabot offers dual enrollment and concurrent enrollment opportunities at ethnic studies, in our college here. And I also wanted to share some photos of our program. In addition to the robust option of courses that we offer in our ethnic studies program, we've been organizing our summits for 4 years now, featuring really seminal, iconic leaders in the movement, such as Bobby Verdugo, who's unfortunately no longer with us, and his wife, Yoli Rios of the Chicano student movement, Erica Huggins of the Black Panther Party. We've taken our students on college campus visits to UC Berkeley, CSU East Bay. We've also brought students to really important field trips to places like the sunrise ceremony at Alcatraz on Indigenous Peoples Day and Angel Island. And next, we also are going to share we've shared a link for participants here. I know many of you might be here perhaps for extra credit for an instructor, and you want to show that you were here. So if you can select this link in the chat, let us know that you were here. Let us know who's your instructor, which class you're taking this for. But also, this is a survey and we want to know your thoughts. We will be sharing this link again at the end of our program today. We'd love to hear from you, and the data that we collect from these surveys help us continue to advocate for more programming like this. Please follow us on Instagram. There's our Instagram tag right there. And just to let you know, we are going to get started with our key focus with our interview with Professor Angela Davis. And the format for today is we're going to have 4 of us, 2 of us faculty and 2 incredible students that have worked very hard on developing these questions for Professor Davis. And we're going to be interviewing Professor Davis for the next 40 to 50 minutes. And towards the end, the last 10 to 15 minutes, we'll make sure that we have enough time to then open it up to the audience. And so at that time, if you want to submit your questions to Professor Davis, please use the Q&A chat box during that time. And next, we're going to have Laura. We're going to have Laura back, and she's going to be introducing Professor Davis for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay. Well, with 720 participants right now in this summit, I will begin my introduction for Dr. Angela Davis. Through her activism and scholarship over many decades, Angela Davis has been deeply involved in movements for social justice around the world. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and in the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of being communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Professor Davis' teaching career has taken her to San Francisco State University, Mills College, and UC Berkeley. She also has taught at UCLA, Syracuse University, the Claremont Colleges, and Stanford University. Most recently, she spent 15 years at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is now a distinguished professor from UC Santa Cruz, from the History of Consciousness program, which is an interdisciplinary PhD program, and of feminist studies. Angela Davis is the author of 10 books and has lectured through the United States as well as in Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and South America. In recent years, a persistent theme of her work has been the range of social problems associated with incarceration and the generalized criminalization of those communities that are most affected by poverty and racial discrimination. She draws up her own experience in the early 70s as a person who spent 18 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. She also has conducted extensive research on numerous issues related to race, gender, and imprisonment. Her recent books include Abolition Democracy and Are Prisons Obsolete? This book is about the abolition of the prison industrial complex. Also, a collection of essays entitled The Meaning of Freedom. Her most recent book of essays called Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. Angela Davis is a founding member of Critical Resistance, a national organization dedicated to the dismantling of the prison industrial complex. Internationally, she is affiliated with Sisters Inside, an abolitionist organization based in Queensland, Australia, that works in solidarity with women in prison. Like many educators, Professor Davis is especially concerned with the general tendency to devote more resources and attention to the prison system than to educational institutions. Having helped to popularize the notion of a prison industrial complex, she now urges her audiences to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without prisons and to help forge a 21st century abolitionist movement. Professor Angela Davis, welcome to Chabot College.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and especially since I live only about 15 to 20 minutes away from the campus. I'm so happy to be able to participate in this event, which is taking place in my own community. And thank you for the beautiful land acknowledgement and the comments by President Sterling. So let me thank the members of the faculty, staff, students, and ethnic studies for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. We are so excited. We have not been able to sleep for the last 2 nights. So thank you so much. Our student panelist, Lahina Morales, will begin today's conversation.
Good morning, Professor Davis. It is an honor to be speaking with you today. So we have some questions that we've prepared for you. And the question is, what is the prison industrial complex, and why is that terminology important when discussing ways to resist mass incarceration of Black people in the United States?
Well, first of all, I should point out that I was a part of a group that developed this terminology based on Mike Davis's work, who was writing about the shift in California from an agricultural economy to a prison economy. And we decided to propose the term prison industrial complex because we thought that that would create the foundation for a conversation about the soaring prison population rate in Black communities that would be able to go further than the question of crime and punishment. So what we attempted to do at that time was what we called disarticulate crime and punishment. That punishment is not simply an effect of crime posited as the cause. We thought that if we could explain the role of racism, the role of structural racism, the role of capitalism, that it might be possible to bring attention to what we thought was a crisis that was not being acknowledged in the public. And so when we when we decided to use the term prison industrial complex, we wanted to make certain that we weren't talking about the actual buildings. We were talking about the relations with the economic system, the fact that deindustrialization had deprived so many Black people, people of color, poor people of jobs, and also the dismantling of what was called the welfare state, that is to say, all of those agencies that people need as a kind of safety net, healthcare, free healthcare, and housing, because this was a moment in the development of capitalism where there were shifts away from those agencies and institutions that really satisfied human need to programs that promoted capitalist profit. And so, therefore, we thought that if we could point out the ways in which the economy, the ways in which the system of politics, the ways in which the media, the emergence of private prisons, etc., that if we could encourage people to think about this crisis in the largest possible terms, then perhaps we would begin to understand why racism was really at the root of this rising prison population among Black people, among the Latinx population, and among Indigenous people.
Thank you. And can you speak to the global framework that's needed when talking about dismantling the prison industrial complex and how this connects to the struggle in Palestine?
Well, that's a really wonderful question. I'm so glad you asked about it, because I think particularly at this moment, we need a more global perspective. We need to recognize what is happening beyond the borders of the US. And of course, the prison industrial complex was a product of global capitalism, the rise of global capitalism in the 1980s. It's not accidental that that's precisely the period when you begin to see the increase in the numbers of people of color behind bars. Now, we are also aware of the fact that in the global South, there was what was called structural adjustment, that resources were moving away from institutions that satisfy people's needs and towards those areas of the economy that were profitable. And of course, against the backdrop of this, we saw the rise of militarization. And then, of course, ultimately, we saw the rise of Islamophobia in connection with what was represented as a so-called war on terror. And the state of Israel was absolutely central in this process of militarizing police departments, not only within Israel-Palestine, but all over the world. As a matter of fact, in the aftermath of the Ferguson Rebellion in 2014, we discovered that this small police force in Ferguson, whom we all saw in the visual images dressed in military garb and using military weapons and driving military vehicles, we learned that they had been trained by Israel. And what was, of course, very interesting was that during the Ferguson protests, Palestinian resistors in occupied Palestine noticed that the same tear gas canisters that were being used against them in occupied Palestine were being used against the Ferguson protesters. And so they then provided aid and assistance and information about how to avoid the most injurious effects of this tear gas. And this led to an awareness that if we look at occupied Palestine, we might gain greater insights about the carceral state in the US, about the rise of incarceration and the rise of state violence, and especially racist state violence carried out by the police.
And can you also speak to how this connects to the ICE detention centers and the incarceration of refugees, asylees, immigrants, including children?
Absolutely. And, let's point out that when we say that the prison industrial complex is very much an element of the global capitalist system, we recognize that it is connected with the effort to maximize profit, whether not so much from private prisons alone, but by the ways in which all of the services and goods that are used by the more than 2 million prisoners who are incarcerated in this country are sources of profit for some corporations. Now, we may have a more thorough discussion of privatization later, but I can say that if one looks at the privatization of prisons, which began to happen in connection with the privatization of healthcare and the increased privatization of education, all of these institutions that we need in order to live and thrive as human beings. If one looks at the ways in which privatization has impacted the system, one sees that the most profitable sector of the private prison industry is precisely immigrant detention. And so therefore, when we talk about the prison industrial complex, we have to include, of course, the detention centers, ICE detention centers, and we have to recognize that the incarceration of immigrants and refugees, including the scandalous incarceration of children and the separation of children from their parents, that this is very much a part of the expansion of the prison industrial complex. And if I may take just a couple of more minutes to point out that so many people now all over the world are immigrating from areas of the global south to Europe, to the US, to Australia, and that this immigration has a logic, and that logic is connected to racism and specifically colonialism. So that the ways in which people in their home countries have been compelled to leave because the impact of global capitalism in their home countries has made it impossible for them to find jobs and housing and to lead decent lives and to engage in a process of subsistence living as was possible before the injection of global capitalism. So in many ways, the reasons why people are compelled to leave their home countries intersects with the reasons why so many people of color are incarcerated inside the US. And therefore, the most natural allies in this struggle against mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex, the most natural allyship would be precisely between those who are supporting immigrant rights and those who are calling for an end to mass incarceration.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. I have the next question for you. In your opinion, is Biden's executive order to terminate federal contracts with private prisons enough to bring an end to the prison industrial complex?
No. I'll just say no. And we can't forget that under the Obama administration, these federal contracts had been canceled with the private prison industry. And it was as a result of their reactivation by the previous occupant of the White House that it became problematic again. But I think it's so important to point out that while we challenge the privatization of prisons, because it helps us to understand the relationship between capitalism and mass incarceration, we should not labor under the illusion that public prisons are any better, and that all we have to do is to get rid of the private prisons. And it should be pointed out that the federal correction system is very, very small compared to the overall system of city and county jails and state prisons and prisons in Indian country and military prisons. So it's just really a drop in the bucket. Although I think it is important that these federal contracts were terminated, but that should not give us cause to celebrate. It simply should give us, it should serve as a signal that we need to continue the struggle.
Thank you.
Professor Davis, in your book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, you mentioned political prisoners from the 60s and 70s who are still incarcerated today, including Sundiata Acoli, Ruchell Magee, the Angola Three, which include Herman Wallace and Albert Woodfox, and Mumia Abu-Jamal. Is this still happening today? And why do we still talk about the persecution of Black activists as it only happened in the past?
Well, it is so important to recognize that there are vast numbers of people in prison who have been there since the 1960s and 1970s. I'm thinking also of Leonard Peltier, who is one of the longest held prisoners in political prisoners in this country. And of course, he was arrested and incarcerated in connection with the Wounded Knee uprising. Yes, there are political prisoners today. Mumia Abu-Jamal, for example, comes from another era. He doesn't come from the 60s and 70s. The era is the 80s. And then there are those who have been imprisoned in connection with MOVE, for example, some of whom were just recently released. There are those who were imprisoned in connection with the struggle for Puerto Rican independence. And many of them spent decades and decades behind bars. And of course, people are still being arrested because of their radical political beliefs and activities today. And let me just take this opportunity to say something that I don't know. It may not be that popular, but I think it's important not to conflate political activism by the left and political activism by the right. And of course, there's a tendency to assume that political prisoners are all the same, whether they're white supremacists or whether they're revolutionaries who want to improve our democracy and create a better world for people. And all of you have probably noticed how this gets conflated by the media, and they compare the white supremacists with the Black Lives Matter activists as if there were any point of comparison. So I think that whenever we are involved in conversations about this, we need to be careful to contest these formalistic ways of trying to bring these issues together. And yeah, I think that it is so important to create the kinds of movements that will not only do the organizing and the mobilizing, but that also protect those who do the work. So that we need organizations that will help to defend those who are arrested. I should tell you that that I was a political prisoner, of course, back in the 1960s, 1970s. I was arrested in 1970 for work that I had done in the late 1960s. And when I was released as a consequence of a vast movement that was created all over the country and all over the world, in virtually every country in the world. Of course, during those days, I was a member of the Communist Party, and the Communist Party had this very powerful international dimension. So that was one of the reasons why the movement was so vast. But when I was released, we created an organization called the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression to continue to try to do the work that would conclude in the liberation of political prisoners. And some of the cases that you mentioned are cases that we began to work on in the 1970s, and they are still behind bars. Ruchell Magee, who was my co-defendant, has been in prison for over 50 years. And that makes no sense under any circumstances.
Thank you, Professor Davis. You spoke about the militarized police in Ferguson, how we were witness to this militarization of police. Could you help us figure out why our general population should be considered about the militarization of police in the United States? And could you connect this to Alameda County? You yourself, you said Chabot College is in your backyard. We are all a part of Alameda County, and perhaps especially with the problem of Urban Shield in Alameda County.
Right. And thank you for bringing up Urban Shield, because there was a massive community movement to prevent Urban Shield from using the Bay Area as its headquarters. And that movement was ultimately successful. But of course, we should be concerned about the militarization of the police in the US. We should be concerned about the police. The police in this country have their origins during slavery. And I think it's always so important as we engage in conversations about aspects of structural racism that need to be addressed today. We should recognize the historical trajectories, the role that colonialism played, and the role that slavery played in establishing the very foundations of the history of this country. But of course, the first police were really the slave patrollers. And in the aftermath of the formal abolition of slavery, well, the primary role of police departments in the South, of course, was the patrolling of newly freed Black people. So this racism is actually built into the structure of policing. The militarization of the police is connected to the rise of the rise of the so-called war on terror, the Islamophobia. This is why I always point out that if we want to understand the nature of racism today, we have to also look at the ways in which structural racism reflects the Islamophobia of the so-called war on terror. But I can also point out that there's been a relationship between the police and the military for a very long time. When I was involved with the Black Panther Party in the late 1960s, and there was an attack on the Los Angeles office of the Black Panther Party, this attack was waged by SWAT. And it was actually the very first project that SWAT engaged in. No one knew the term SWAT. And these police officers were former Green Berets. They specifically recruited people who had been involved in the war in Vietnam, recognizing that they would be the ones to combat the rise of Black militancy within the US. So I think there are ways to talk about this long history of exchange between the military and the police. But the urban shield, which took place in Alameda County, the war games that they created reflected a very specific influence of the Israeli government. And again, we were talking about Israel before, but again, this was one of the primary reasons why the Arab Resource Center, Critical Resistance, and other organizations became involved in this campaign to prevent Urban Shield from doing their war games and conducting their exposition of articles, militarized articles used by the police here in our community.
Thank you, Professor Davis. In your book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, you wrote that naming streets after historical figures deflect from actual social problems. Can you connect that to performative activism we've seen since this summer's uprising? For example, we see from major corporations appropriating the hashtag Black Lives Matter slogan to sell their products.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't have any problems with naming streets. I think it's great that Grove Street is MLK Boulevard now, right? But when this becomes the only way governments, city governments, et cetera, respond to the problem of racism, all you have to do is name a street after Dr. King and you've done your work. Then that is what deflects attention away from the actual work we have to do to eradicate racism. And I think performative activism, which is a relatively new term that has become widely known thanks to social media, of course, is a similar kind of phenomenon. It's about giving the appearance of making contributions to the struggle against racism, whereas one actually is doing nothing at all. But there's another side of this issue that I want to point out, because one of the points that I always like to make is that we always find ourselves in complicated circumstances. We're always entangled in contradictions. And we can't expect to resolve all of those contradictions. And in many ways, we have to learn how to live within the contradictions and recognize, for example, that the very fact that people want to be perceived as activists in the struggles against racism and gender violence and capitalism and so forth is a good thing. because it means that the work that we as activists have done has had an impact, and people want to be associated with that. And I'm glad, even if they don't do anything. And it's also the case that when capitalist corporations appropriate Black Lives Matter to sell their products, it's obvious that they're interested in the very first place in selling their products and making a profit. And I don't know whether we need to expend so much energy in trying to get them to stop doing this, because they'll find another way to make profit. And sometimes that that Black Lives Matter slogan might fall upon ears of people who are really receptive. So I think that we have to recognize this as part of the terrain when we do this work within the context of a capitalist society. But this is also why we have to learn how to acknowledge the impact of capitalism. Capitalism is always the elephant in the room. It's always responsible for so much damage and so much injury and so much racism and so much heteropatriarchy. But we don't often center conversations around capitalism. So I think that that is the work that we have to do. And my position has always been that when our radical ideas get appropriated, let's see that as a kind of victory, because it means that the work that we're doing makes a difference. But at the same time, rather than argue with them about their appropriation of our work, let's figure out how to do something that's even more radical. So let's up the ante when this happens, rather than using that energy to criticize them.
Thank you. We saw you participate in a panel titled The Fight for Ethnic Studies. There's currently a debate over the state of California's model ethnic studies curriculum. Can you tell us more about this struggle, and what are your thoughts on how ethnic studies should be taught, and why is there a resistance to an emancipatory, decolonial, critical ethnic studies framework?
Well, first of all, there's always been resistance. When the first ethnic studies program was created at San Francisco State in 1968 as a consequence of the longest student strike that we had experienced, it was actually supposed to be called Third World Studies, because the organizers wanted to make it very clear that they were connected to struggles for liberation unfolding in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. And of course, ethnic studies was the compromise term because it seemed less revolutionary. And now, of course, we often use the term critical ethnic studies because we want to continue that connection with struggles for emancipatory futures, decolonial ethnic studies, emancipatory ethnic studies. And this is not the way in which those who control the educational system want to see us proceed. So therefore, this current battle, this current struggle is over the inclusion of Arab American studies. And it's so interesting that it's okay to have Black studies, it's okay to have Latinx studies, Indigenous studies, Asian American studies, but when you get to Arab American studies, it brings up the question of Palestine. And so that has been the major struggle over the last period. And we've been organizing this campaign to persuade the powers that be that you cannot create these exceptions. You cannot say that everybody is welcome, but not Palestinians. You cannot say, as happened in an instance where I was offered a human rights award in Birmingham, Alabama, by the Institute of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. They retracted the award, at least temporarily, and the explanation was that I was doing work around Palestine, as if human rights is a valuable instrument except when it refers to Palestinians who are struggling against their freedom. So I think that this is a really important struggle in California and in our area to stand up for the right of students to learn about the struggles in Palestine, the struggle against racism, the struggle against colonialism. Israel is the only settler colonial state that continues to try to expand. When one looks at the ways in which all of the settlements have deprived Palestinians of their own land.
Thank you, Professor Davis. I will ask the next question. And after this, there's one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the public for questions. So in Freedom is a Constant Struggle, you mentioned that Assata Shakur and yourself were put on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Yet the violence that you experienced in your youth in the Deep South has never been classified as terrorism. Can you speak to this double standard from the FBI to categorize violence and terrorism? Also, is there a connection to the events that occurred on January 6th? And if you feel comfortable, could you please share with us what you felt and what you saw on January 6th on a very personal level?
Well, thank you so much for that question. And this has always bothered me that there is this absolute reluctance to acknowledge the part that terrorism has played in the history of the United States. And of course, I can talk about my own experiences growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, but I think at first we need to look at the fact that colonialism produced genocides. That was terror against indigenous people. Slavery was based on violence. It was based on the terrorization of African descended people who were compelled to work for nothing, whose labor was stolen, whose bodies were owned. And then, of course, growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, I experienced some of this terror firsthand. As a matter of fact, I often point out that my oldest memories are the sounds of bombs exploding. I lived in a community that was a zone for Black people, but we lived on the border of that community. Across the street, Black people were not even allowed to be present unless they were workers. And so if a Black person actually bought a house across the street, and this happened because there were white allies who would purchase a house and then turn it over to a Black family, the response from the Ku Klux Klan, the White Citizens Council, the city government was to attack the house. And so I can remember the sound of bombs exploding across the street from my house when I was very, very young. And what many people aren't aware of is the fact that the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, which led to the deaths of 4 beautiful young Black girls, that was a normal event. It wasn't exceptional. That churches were bombed and houses were bombed and synagogues were bombed, as a matter of fact, because the races were also anti-Semitic. And the first white allies that Black communities had in the South were largely Jewish people. So I think that, that it is important to make this point that the terror has been with us, and that it has been inflected with racism. And it continues to happen, as we saw on January 6th. I do want to point out that, that of course we have a long way to go before we eradicate racism. But many of us, including myself, were not aware of the degree to which white supremacy has taken hold over the most recent period. I mean, of course, I knew that there were white supremacist organizations, and the Southern Poverty Law Fund keeps a list of these organizations. But the fact that, not only the fact that this attack on the White House happened on January 6th, but the fact that the majority of white people in this country voted for the person who wanted to bring fascism to the White House, when we just got rid of, is an indication of the role that this racist terror continues to play. And of course, if it had not been for that presidency and the terrible ways in which it reconnected with the racist past, we probably would not be dealing with such a humongous problem now. But it is absolutely essential to make that connection. So thank you so much for raising that question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Davis. So this is going to be our last question from the panel, and then Laura will help facilitate Q&A from the audience. Lastly, you have a new book coming out. I believe the ebook is scheduled to come out this month. It's called Abolition, Period, Feminism, Period, Now, Period. Could you tell us a little bit more about the book, what we can expect?
Okay, this is a collaborative book. My collaborators are Beth Ritchie, Erica Miners, and Gina Dent. The 4 of us actually began to write this book before the pandemic. So we were already accustomed to having our meetings on Zoom and doing our work in that way when, of course, everything changed. So it's not the book that we thought we were writing. But what we are trying to argue is that, first of all, abolition, prison abolition, police abolition, is so essential to a liberatory feminism. We cannot contend with the carceral feminisms that believe that the way to protect women from violence is by enlarging police forces and by sending perpetrators to prison where they encounter an even more violent environment, which means that once they're released, they're probably going to be more violent than they were when they went in. And this does not help us. This exclusive and myopic focus on individual perpetrators, it doesn't help us to get rid of the larger problem of misogyny and heteropatriarchy. So you might say that the same insight, that the collective insight that emerged in the aftermath of the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, that police violence, racist violence is structural, that racism is structural. It's not simply a character flaw of individuals. So that this is why we argue that the most productive feminisms will be abolition feminisms. But we also are trying to engage in conversations with abolitionist activists to point out that feminism, and when we say feminism, we mean anti-racist feminism, we mean anti-capitalist feminism. That feminism has played a major role in developing abolitionist approaches and abolitionist strategies, and that abolition is at its best when it has a pronounced feminist dimension, just as feminism is at its best when it has a pronounced abolitionist dimension. So I don't know whether we're going to be done by next month when this is the first time I've heard that the ebook is supposed to be coming out in a month. But we've sent the manuscript in, but we have to, do the last edits before we allow it to be read by the public.
Thank you so much, Professor Davis. So now we're going to open it up for questions from our faculty, students, members of the community. Before we go there, I want to let everybody know that we have 779 participants in this summit. And we also want to give thanks to Gabriel Chaparro, who is actually a person behind the scenes. He is our STEM equity coordinator who helped us put all this webinar together and who's behind the scenes. And of course, Professor Ulises Acevedo, who is also behind the scene answering questions and managing all these questions. So we will start the questions now. And Adriana is asking this question. Maestra Davis, what are some of the national and/or international and local immigrant rights organizations you follow or support?
Oh, there are quite a number of immigrant rights organizations that I support, and I, along with my comrades and sisters and brothers, have insisted on bringing this issue into other social justice campaigns, because it seems to me that if we talk about civil rights and human rights, the group that is globally in need of international support of their rights are refugees and immigrants. Not only in the US, but in Australia or in France, in Italy, in the UK. And I have to say that I've been in conversation with some people in other parts of the world about the possibility perhaps of a global summit on this issue. Because we often assume that this is a national problem, that this is, and this is of course the way it gets represented by those in power, particularly those who try to build walls and have detention facilities, and who argue that if immigrants come into the country, they're going to take jobs away. I mean, it's all about this very racist way of generating the kind of reaction that will prevent us from moving in the direction of democracy for us all. And let me say that all over the world, the slogan, "No one is illegal," is reverberating. And it's about time that we talk about citizenship in a different way. Citizenship is not primarily about paper. Citizenship is about commitment. Citizenship is about struggle for a better world, for better futures, for emancipatory futures. And I think that, I mean, I know that I'm not specifically answering your question about organizations right now, but I do think it is important to have the larger perspective. And of course, my training is in philosophy, so I always try to create a more capacious way of understanding the issue. And in that context, I just want to say that we cannot assume that the nation state is a permanent phenomenon. It occurred through history. The nation state, as we know it, is a product of capitalism. And who knows how long it will last, but I'm certain that in the future, that is to say, if we survive all of the climate catastrophes, and if this planet is still habitable by human and other animals, that the nation state in the future will not be the primary way of organizing human community, and that we will have something that we might call global citizenship, and that we won't have these repressive, walls and formations like ICE that are oftentimes even more racist and even more violent than our local police.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. We have about 10 more questions. We want to make sure that we get all of them in before we have to let you go. So Leon is asking, how do zoning laws affect prison populations?
Zoning laws, well, it's so interesting that if one looks at prison populations anywhere in the country, one will discover that the majority come from certain zip codes. And this is the reason why we're arguing that the problem is not about reforming the prison. It's not about creating a better prison. It's about creating a better world. It's about creating a world in which people in all neighborhoods have access to the services they need to get healthcare, to get education, to get housing, to get jobs. It's so interesting that in California, for example, it's people from Oakland, certain areas of Oakland, and people from certain areas of Los Angeles that are in the so-called correctional institutions up and down the state. And if you look in those neighborhoods, if you look in those zip codes, what kind of schools do you find? There's a relationship between the lack of education or the ways in which police, what do they call, school resource officers, are the ones who determine what happens in these elementary and high schools. So the schools themselves become almost prep schools for prison. So that this is a good argument for the approach that abolitionists take. It's not about creating a better prison. It's about creating a better world. It's about creating worlds in which people have the capacity to develop themselves, both economically, educationally, culturally, and then we would be able to figure out where the real problems are. What is the real threat to our safety and security? And of course, abolitionists don't deny that there are major problems that involve violence that have to be resolved, but you can't get rid of gender violence, as I was pointing out, simply by sending individuals to prison over and over again, because that actually complicates the violence and probably makes ends up making them more violent. So that we have to figure out how to get rid of the ideologies of misogyny, and how to solve these social problems that will allow kids to look forward to the future, to recognize that they have futures and that they can contribute to the creation of better worlds.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. I will, the next question is from Octavio, and he asks, what are some action strategies that are being done and or can be done to impact change with the prison industrial complex?
One of our first strategies is to call for decarceration. And this is a very important term. Rather than incarceration, decarceration, begin to release people from prison. Another strategy is a moratorium on jail and prison construction. And of course, all over the country, movements have developed to contest the creation of new jails or new prisons. In New York, for example, with Rikers Island in the process of being shut down, excuse me, there have been proposals to build new jails. And those of us who've been calling for the shutdown of Rikers for who knows how long were very angry when this new proposal came out, because it completely militates against what we were trying to do in calling for the shutdown of the jail. And if one looks at the entire history of the prison system, one discovers that the reforms that have accompanied the development of this institution, there have always been calls for prison reform. I mean, this should tell you that there was something wrong with this mode of punishment in the first place, where people were opposed to it and were calling for reforms from the very outset. And then if you look at the history of those reforms, you see that those reforms have actually had the effect of rendering the institutions more violent, more permanent, more repressive. And so I like to think of the reforms as the glue that actually holds institutions such as the prison and the police together. And the ways in which we engage in activism against the prison industrial complex is to try to prevent the further expansion of this system. But then, abolitionist perspectives are very large, they're capacious, and they have to do not only with the institution of the prison, but they have to do with creating new modes of justice and beginning to introduce restorative justice and transformative justice. And also beginning to recognize that we have internalized so much of the work that prisons do in our own emotional reactions. So that we have to think about how we are often the unintentional perpetuators of these retributive strategies. When someone does something bad to us, our first instinct is to get back at them. And that's retribution. And that's what the punishment system is all about. So abolition asks us to think holistically about all of these questions, whether they be about the construction of prisons, whether they be about the economics of the prison industrial complex, whether they be about the ways in which our psyches are informed as well.
We have our next question from Charmaine. What are your thoughts on the rise of violence against Asian Americans and how it perpetuates the anti-Blackness that already exists within those two communities?
Well, yeah, I think it's so important to recognize the specificities of racism and the specificities of racist violence. It's not all the same, and precisely because of the history of racist violence against Asian communities, going back to the 19th century. And the importation of Chinese workers, but of course also considering the fact that Japanese Americans were incarcerated in what amounted to concentration camps during World War II. So I think it's so important for us to keep these histories in our minds and to recognize how easy it is for someone in power to make a racist statement about Asians and to have this plethora of violent assaults on Asians taking place all over the country. And I think this, it's an indication of the fact that we all have to stand together. There's a question about anti-Black violence, and I'm trying to look at the. I lost the question. Who was it by? Who was the person asking the question?
Do you want me to? Let's see. I can go back and I can see. Which
yeah, I'm looking at the questions, and I'm just trying to. Well, in any event, I think I can answer it because I know we don't have a great deal of time. I think that it is important to recognize that racism is a powerful ideology, and it affects us all. It affects people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds. Black people, many Black people have internalized anti-Asian stereotypes and racism. And the very fact that these sports teams have been able to use the names of indigenous nations and to use indigenous references within derogatory frameworks. And it's just now that the Washington team, after all of these years, finally recognized that they have to change the names. So this struggle against racism is going to be multifaceted. We have to be really attentive, and Black people need to be attentive to the way racism plays out in Latinx communities and Asian communities and Muslim communities. We're all in this together, and I like to use a phrase that Jackie Alexander, the Black feminist sociologist, always talks about. It's just we have to learn each other's stories. We have to learn each other's stories and be capable of becoming, of developing solidarity.
Thank you so much. We only have 4 minutes, okay?
So.
And we wanted to ask our last question, and this: with so many youth in attendance today, can you share your thoughts about the importance of the role of ethnic studies and their participation in organizing within their communities to address the most pressing issues they face?
Well, yeah, that's really important. And I think that, first of all, I should tell you that I once taught in ethnic studies at San Francisco State. So I've been, following the development of the field for a very long time. And I think that what is so important about the methodologies and the theoretical frameworks of ethnic studies is that it is interdisciplinary. And I think, of course, the disciplines are important. Many of you are probably majoring in, English or a science discipline or a social science discipline, sociology. And the disciplines have been the primary way in which knowledge has been professionalized over time. However, interdisciplinary approaches are really important because if one confines oneself to a discipline, the discipline defines the theoretical framework. It defines the kinds of questions that can or cannot be asked, and therefore it always excludes something. Whereas interdisciplinary frameworks allow us to engage in a kind of problem-centered course of study that we state a problem or we ask a question, and then we consult various disciplines and fields in order to try to generate an answer. And so we're talking about all of the new developments in education, not only ethnic studies and all of the components of ethnic studies, Black studies, Indigenous studies, Latinx studies, etc. But we're also, we're talking about feminist studies. We're talking about cultural studies. We're talking about queer studies and the field of trans studies that has just begun to develop. And of course, I should point out that that is so important because the gender binary has been taken for granted for such a long time. It has been beyond the capacity of our questions. And now we recognize that this so-called normal state of affairs is not normal at all. It's ideological. And we can begin to dismantle it. And we can begin to talk about gender in ways that allow for the flourishing of people who do not identify according to the polarity of the gender binary, but who differently identify. And this has been such a stimulus for new ideas and new kinds of struggle, new ways of thinking about the world. And ethnic studies helps to create this framework that allows us to reach beyond what is considered to be the normal state of affairs with respect to knowledge. Ethnic studies helps us to conceptualize, what we often call critical prison studies, that we have a great deal to learn about and from, especially from those who are engaging in intellectual work behind bars. And as you see, I could continue probably for the next hour talking about this, but I know that your time is up. So I think I will end there.
Thank you so much, Professor Davis. We could definitely spend another hour here with you. And believe me, we wouldn't mind it. We are so grateful that you accepted our invitation. I also want to acknowledge, the efforts of many people in the college, the staff, the faculty, the deans, our students, who actually engage in all of these activities to bring you here, Dr. Davis, because it definitely takes a village, especially it always takes a village, and we double the village when all of this is online. So before we go, and before our ethnic studies professor closes the event, we wanted to ask you, we asked you many, many questions. And are there any final thoughts that you think, or any topics that we did not touch, or anything in particular that you would like to share with us before we close this event?
Oh, wow. Thank you for this opportunity. I think that I would emphasize what an important moment this is. and how wonderful it is to be alive at this moment, that you get to witness how history happens. And we know that we would not be at this conjuncture that was initially a response to the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, had people not been doing organizing work for years and decades. And I know that as an abolitionist, I never in my wildest imagination thought that there would come such a time that I would get to, I knew that this time would come, but I didn't think that I would get to experience it because I imagined it happening far in the future. And of course, this is a moment where we can make some really major radical changes. If institutions begin to look at the ways in which their structures have promoted and helped to perpetuate racism and heteropatriarchy. We can't think of racism outside of patriarchy and outside of capitalist exploitation. So that I would just like to urge all of you to participate in this process. Sometimes we think that the most important moments are those moments, dramatic moments where we get to see all of the people in the streets, and that's wonderful and intense. But the real work happens in quieter circumstances. So it's up to us now to do the work that will make this moment last and move us in the direction of liberatory futures.
Muchísimas gracias, Professor Davis, and give it away to Kay. It's your turn.
Thank you. I wish we can end on that note because your words are so incredibly powerful. Thank you so much, Professor Davis, and for giving us this gift, this reminder that the important work comes in the quiet moment, for sure. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. If I may share my screen one more time, I just wanted to end on with some reminders. So the survey link has been submitted in the chat several times. If you haven't had an opportunity to fill it out, please do. We will also be forwarding this information in a follow-up email if you registered with us. Please follow us on Instagram at Ethnic Studies Chabot. And our summit is actually a 2-day event. We were so honored to speak with you, Professor Davis, and we are very excited to continue this event next Friday, same time, 9:30 a.m. with Maria Hinojosa, one of the foremost journalists doing really incredible work out there. And we'll be doing the same thing, asking her questions, and there's still room. So please register at that link, and we hope to see you next Friday. Have a good weekend, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Davis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
And all of the ghouls come out to play. And every demon wants its pound of flesh. But I like to keep some things to myself. I like to keep my shoes drawn. It's always darkest before